Okay, hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining. Thanks for filing in here to the boxes. Welcome. This is the Brooklyn Rail 546th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the real privilege of being an MC today for your conversation featuring Vasyl Cherepanyn and Alexi Roddinski, and this is moderated and organized by Katya Grokhovsky, and it's co-organized and curated by Adriana Farmiga as well as Slinko. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. Thank you all really for taking your important time to be here with us today. And we are very lucky to hear these guests speak today. So to introduce first Katya. Katya, born and raised in Ukraine, Katya Grokhovsky is an artist, curator, and founding director of the Immigrant Artist Biennial. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, and she's received support through many residencies, including Sculpture Space, Fine Arts Department, the Oxbow, Mosaic Artist Residency, and she's been awarded a NIFA Fiscal Scholarship, Asylum Arts Grant, and many more. Adriana Farmiga is an interdisciplinary artist, educator, and associate dean at Cooper Union. She has shown her work in group and solo exhibitions in numerous places, and her work has also been reviewed in the New York Times and Art Forum, among many other places. Vasyl Cherepanyn is a curator, political activist, and scholar. He is the head of the award-winning Visual Culture Research Center, an institution founded in Kyiv in 2008 as a platform for collaboration among academic, artistic, and activist communities. He co-edited Guidebook of the Kyiv International and 68 Now. He curated the European International and Hybrid Peace. And I will be sharing lots of links to that work. He is in Ukraine right now. We are also joined by Alexi Roddinski today, who is a Kyiv-based filmmaker. His award-winning films have been screened at the International Film Festival in Rotterdam, many other places, the Institute of Contemporary Arts, SAVVY Contemporary in Berlin. After graduating from Kyiv Academy, he studied at the Home Workspace program, and in 2008, he co-founded the Visual Culture Research Center. And we just also want to extend a special thank you to Slinko, who helped organize today. Born in Ukraine, Slinko is a multidisciplinary artist living in the USA. Her practice is rooted in travel and research and is informed by history and social anthropology. So thank you all again so much for being here, and I will pass it over to Katya. All right, I meant to say I will pass it to Adriana.
Adriana, yes.
No worries. Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you so much to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail and Fong and Nick and Carolyn and everyone who's helped put this together. I believe that we are having a very thoughtful and substantive series of conversations about solidarity in and about Ukraine. So I wanted to thank you again, express my gratitude, and hopefully encourage you all to join in the subsequent conversations that we have planned, which should be rolling out in the next few weeks or the next month to 2 months. And for those in Ukraine, a quick note. Хочу щиро привітати вас всіх, що є в Україні. Я знаю, що там пізно тепер є. Ми щоденно про вас думаємо і молимося за мир і перемогу. Слава Україні. And I will now pass the mic to Katya, who will lead the conversation, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adriana. All right. Okay, so I wanted to thank everyone for being here today with us, to Brooklyn Rail for hosting us, for organizing, helping us with a series of these events. I believe there will be 3 of these discussions basically about Ukraine by Ukrainians. I wanted to thank Slinko as well for helping us put the panelists together, for invitations, for questions. And we have 2 panelists today. Katerina couldn't make it, unfortunately, today, but she'll make it to another discussion that we'll have in May or June. So we kind of threw out some questions. They're pretty, open-ended, but I'll sort of just go through the questions right now so you know what we were talking about, and the panelists were sort of could either discuss the questions, answer the questions, or just talk about the situation right now. So the first question, what do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions the West and the Western left has about the war in Ukraine? Second question was sort of a statement question, thoughts. We have to acknowledge that not only the physical infrastructure in Ukraine is damaged, but the infrastructure of its cultural institutions is affected by this horrific war. And we sincerely hope we can already think of rebuilding Ukraine in the future, near future. What would be the most significant supportive actions the Western cultural institutions can provide Ukrainian cultural workers? What kind of cultural initiatives we here in the West need to be anticipating and getting behind to be better allies to Ukrainian culture? And third question, we realize that no matter what we do, we have a likelihood of falling short, mishandling even the questions on this panel, on this during these discussions. So we'd like to ask instead, what questions we are not asking you, but should be asking you? What would you rather talk about? So I'd like to give the mic to Vasyl next. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks so much. And do you hear me well, just in case to check out? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, first of all, I would like to express really my deep gratitude to all the organizers, to Katya, Carolyn, and Adriana, and to Brooklyn Rail for hosting us here today. I do believe that, especially under the current circumstances, every voice, every opportunity does count. So I genuinely perceive this event today as a real solidarity action, which is very, very much needed. So thank you so much again for having us today. So first of all, what I have to say to kick off this conversation, because I would say that I would rather stick to this open format as a kind of a live exchange. But we also, since and thanks again for the kind introduction, but we together with Alexi, we co-founded our Visual Culture Research Center and have been running it for years already, for 14 years, since 2008, which is also the organizer of the Kyiv Biennial, by the way. But in the current situation, I have to say that I wouldn't like to pretend that we are still in a kind of cultural framework, because that is exactly the direct outcome, the already existent outcome of the war, that all the societal fields in sociological sense, so to say, have been destroyed. So we are in some sense on the wreckages of the usual life. Of course, we can conceive and think of some future projects online and so on, but at the same time, we don't have any cultural life in a usual sense in Ukraine anymore. So in this sense, we are sort of still kind of pretend to operate within the cultural framework, but at the same time, it's really not exactly true. So I have to state this openly, that we are actually, at least from my side, a kind of I'm presenting a voice which is in some sense rather not a voice of a cultural professional, but rather a voice of a person who is going through those circumstances that one could hardly believe before the 24th of February. But I would like to start also by saying that I think the most important part of those posed questions is the absent one. I mean, the third one, those that we were not asked. But somehow I think that this part is already inscribed in those first two questions that were formulated by Katya. Thank you again. I think that the most important part to speak about today, being at war, because we anyhow are all on the battlefield in some sense. We are just lucky enough and privileged enough that I still have some light and running water here, unlike millions of my compatriots. And actually that is exactly because the Ukrainian military in the north, in the south and the east of Ukraine is doing everything possible and really physically impossible to make this happen. So let's keep in mind that it's not only about some political fetishes, and that's not only a topic for the talk. This is something much more obviously than that. So in this sense, being at war, I think the most important part is to talk, of course, about the revolution, which is a kind of a missing part, but it's a crucial, I think, with regards to the current circumstances, because and in this sense it directly refers to the first question which has been posed about the West, possible Western misconception. I think these are both are very much connected in the sense that I think that the biggest problem is in this regard is not some kind of misconception of the West, but quite the opposite, a pretty clear understanding of the West, of what has been happening all the time. But the problem is not some misconception, but an inaction, because the more you allow the injustice to occur, the more it goes on. And in this sense, I think this war, which basically we also have to say started actually 8 years ago in 2014, on the 24th of February, it just turned to be a full-scale invasion. But it was made possible exactly because of this inaction. I mean, this full-scale invasion, because not only the European countries, but the so-called collective West, or whatever you call it in general, has gotten pretty well along with the constant ongoing war, which was just proclaimed as a kind of a ceasefire or a frozen peace. But in reality, it was a constant war. And actually, I think all in all, as such, it is really a part of it is very much inscribed in some bigger global picture, I think, which is, I think this is a part of, so to say, a global counter-revolution that we are going through for quite some time already. And here, that's why I mentioned the revolution, meaning also very concretely the Ukrainian Maidan uprising or revolution, or whatever you call it, in 2013 and 14, which, by the way, was a local manifestation of the global wave of so-called square occupation uprisings, right? Which took place from the US, Occupy Wall Street, to Arab Spring in the Middle Eastern countries, to Indignados in Europe, from Spain to other countries across Europe. And I think all the outcomes that we face today is the result of unwillingness to learn from the revolutionary experience that we had. And actually, this kind of unwillingness, I'm following here really according to the classics in a way, as the famous statement by German philosopher Walter Benjamin goes, behind each fascism there is a failed revolution. So in this sense, I think it always strikes back. It always takes its own revenge in a way, in the sense that when you don't use the revolutionary chance for real political change, which always comes at a price, then you face the counter-revolutionary, reactionary consequences that we are now in Ukraine feeling on our own skin. So in this sense, I mean, it's also very much adjustable to the US realities in this sense, because I mean, if you take into account the Iraq war and the lies about it as a pretext to start it, what is the outcome of it? Of course, you have Trump and the big lie about so-called rigged elections, when the whole world is just making fun, tragically, of how the Americans can believe in this shit. But this is a reality that you cannot avoid, actually. The same happened with those revolutionary chances across the world. Because if you agree that the so-called red line, which was proclaimed by Obama, didn't exist actually, with regards to the Russian actions in Syria, which was also a counter-revolutionary action to suppress the revolutionary chance. And that is the most striking point, I think, in all this, in all the current context that we have, that basically all those revolutionary chances across the world, which we really had in our hands in a way, they were suppressed in a military way, or maybe in a reactionary way. So instead of the Occupy Wall Street, you've got Trump, the situation that you are much more aware than I do here. In Europe, instead of this welcoming culture towards refugees, we've got totally anti-refugee stance across Europe. Instead of all the revolutions in the Arab world, as well as it also works for Ukraine as well, they were all suppressed by different types of war. In most of them, the Russian Federation was directly involved. Let's be blunt in that regard. And if you allow this to happen, then there is no surprise that we are stuck in this current predicament that we have. And I think it's also very important not to pretend that this war in the periphery, so to say, of the West is just simply another war, and we in the West, in this so-called metropolis, are just dealing with some indirect consequences of that. I think that the most obscene to be said today that this war, so let's not pretend that this war is somebody else's war. It's our common war. Unfortunately, it's very unfortunate, really. But at the same time, I think that this kind of reactionary conditions that we are forcefully placed in is basically the result of this constant inaction. And with regards to the second question, basically, it's not only that the cultural infrastructure that we think of has to be rebuilt in, I hope, in the near future, but I think it's the very state of the current democracy that will have to be rebuilt, because again, it's not some prepared statement from my side, but maybe it's more like some random thoughts. But I'm constantly thinking, you know, how this inertness, which is perhaps woozy from the horrors of war, what does it do, and in what way, and how does it affect the current democratic society that we are still claiming? Because you know, that is also a very it's not just a political or an ideological question. It's in a stricto sensu, it's biopolitical question, because how does observing the unbearable affect us? What does it do to our democracy if we are still claiming that? Or is I don't know, Ursula von der Leyen and Josep Borrell, the chiefs of the European Union, visit to Bucha near Kyiv, being surrounded by the tortured and killed Ukrainians in black bags, is it bearable enough? Or what would be then unbearable in this sense? The use of chemical weapons of Russia, a tactical nuclear strike? Because I think we all know, of course, I mean, let me put it clear, we all know this no NATO intervention argument, right? That no boots on the ground, no fighter jets. We already learned that lesson. But at the same time, I'm really wondering what kind of long-going or far-going effect it will have on the state and on the modus operandi of our societies. Does it really affect them in some sense? So in this context, I think that that is something to be, of course, to be decided, because we are just amidst the war catastrophe, and we don't have clear answers, and we are not even aware of what lies ahead of us. But at the same time, I think with regards to the political role of cultural institutions. So that's why I really very much thankful for Brooklyn Rail for organizing that. I think what is also very important to emphasize from my side, just to wrap it up here, is that for quite some time, during the recent weeks, what I've personally and also institutionally encountered in various communications with our Western counterparts, because we, of course, I mean, I think that all the representatives that are participating here, as well as those who joined us, they either way represent those cultural subjects and institutions which claim some type of politicality, which are mostly interested in political engagement and social involvement and so on. So in this sense, I think what was really striking for me that during those communications that I had during these recent weeks, that all those politically involved institutions, they appeared to be not ready to go really political when the time arrived. And that is a strange moment. So they were rather willing to stick to this kind of, you know, radical Sikh revolt, or some type of, how should I put it, to comfortable white cube radicalism, campus radicalism, but not going directly into realpolitik. Because I think, of course, we totally understand that, because all the institutions are somehow framed and restricted because of their public or state affiliation and so on. They have their own rules to follow and so forth. But at the same time, I think what would be, even in such conditions, really very, very important is not just for the cultural institutions foremost, is not just to stick to some humanitarian stance, so to say, you know, just speaking about refugees, all the variety of aid, which of course, without which Ukraine wouldn't survive through this war catastrophe. But at the same time, if we are speaking exactly about the political role of cultural institutions, I think the most important would be to stick to those projects and to work with those artists and to organize those events which are aimed at creating constant discomfort in order to make as much pressure as possible, both on the respective governments in your countries and towards your publics, your audiences. Because I think the main thing is not to let the Western audiences and the Western governments to feel self-satisfied as if they are doing enough. It's never enough until the war is over. I put comma here and thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Vasyl. I wanted to say that people, if you have questions directly to our panelists or, well, our guests or just in general, you can put them in the chat and we'll do a Q&A after we finish speaking with our guests. So I'm going to actually just go over the questions again and then go give the mic over to Alexi. Just a second. All right, so just to kind of repeat our questions that were just sort of open-ended to begin our conversation that were given to our guests. First question, what do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions the West and the Western left has about the war in Ukraine? We have to acknowledge that not only the physical infrastructure in Ukraine is damaged, but the infrastructure of its cultural institutions is affected by this horrific war. But we sincerely hope that we can already think of rebuilding Ukraine in the near future. What would be the most significant supportive actions the Western cultural institutions can provide Ukrainian cultural workers? What kind of cultural initiatives we here in the West need to be anticipating and getting behind to be better allies to Ukrainian culture? And last question, we realize that no matter what we do, we have a likelihood of falling short or mishandling even the questions here. So we would like to ask instead, what questions we are not asking you, but must ask you? What would you rather talk about? So Alexi, I'll give it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I hope you hear me well. It's great to be here, and it's a special pleasure for me to reunite with my comrade of many years, Vasyl. And it also would have been an even bigger pleasure to also reunite with Katarina Ruban, who is also our comrade for many years at VCRC. I hope you all meet her soon. Yeah, and indeed, my plan was to be much more literal with my reactions to these important questions that we are facing here. And frankly, I would like to, after Vasyl's statement, to build on it by kind of dwelling a little bit on this quote that he drew from Walter Benjamin, about the outcome of each failed revolution, that is fascism. And basically, the response to the question about the biggest misconception that the left has about the war in Ukraine, I would say that the biggest misconception, a disastrous misconception, and kind of a disastrous blindness, I would say, that's very surprising on the left, is the kind of inability to recognize fascism these days and to see fascism where it actually is. I think it's kind of striking. And of course, by that, I mean, like, I just had a kind of couple of interesting conversations with friends who are based in Germany and in Europe these days. And I was really surprised when they told me that, we have a problem here. It's really kind of difficult or almost impossible to actually call Putin a Nazi when you're in Germany, for instance. It's like, it's still kind of not really acceptable. Some people have problems with that. some people think it's offensive, especially I think it's strange, but also understandably strange in the German context. So there are kind of, in Europe, there's an opinion that there's a kind of monopoly on defining what is real fascism, yeah, and who are actually the Nazis, and you cannot just kind of say this openly about the Russian Federation, whereas I think this is becoming a tragic misconception that leads to kind of really great kind of inaction, yeah, that Vasyl referred to, and this is the failure to accept the fact that the Russian Federation these days is actually a fascist state. Yeah, it's an openly fascist regime that is led by an openly fascist leader. And when I say fascist, I don't mean this in a colloquial way. Yeah, like when you really dislike someone, you know, in a public space or debate, there's an affinity sometimes to colloquially call someone a fascist. It's a slur. So when I say fascist, I mean this literally. I think it's very difficult. For us here, it's very kind of strange to see how this is not recognized. I mean, the way that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been unfolding is a textbook case of a fascist war that is based on a denial of right to exist to a certain political group. It was basically explicitly stated as such during the declaration of war by the Russian president, when the Russian blitzkrieg of the first weeks obviously failed in Ukraine. The Russian state agent I repeat, of the Russian Federation that were openly calling for the genocide of Ukrainians, that were calling for reforming camps, concentration camps for those who survive, where Ukrainians would be kind of reformed from being Ukrainians, and so on. Yeah, so this has all been happening, and we, I mean, this kind of list of textbook examples of textbook properties of the fascist regime could go on, and I think another kind of reason why the West, like the Western left, and basically the European even governments are kind of blind about this is that it's really uncomfortable to acknowledge that this is not some kind of alien fascism. Yeah, it's not like some kind of barbaric Eastern fascism. It's not Eurasian. It's not Asian fascism. It's good old European fascism in the new guise. Yeah, I mean, like Russian fascism is basically the bastard of European fascism, and it's also a product of European fascism. Yeah, if you look even on the level of the official, I mean, of kind of history, theory, and philosophy that underlies the Putinist regime, there are official philosophers here who have this kind of status of the favorite philosophers of Putin. Yeah, like the well-known pseudo-philosopher Ivan Ilyin, who was an openly fascist sympathizer during the interwar period, who was calling for kind of for the ruler that's a sovereign whose will is an emanation of God and things like that. So this guy, an open fascist, has been providing theoretical grounds for the rule of Putin for many years, and so on. Of course, we could draw another historical parallel that's even too obvious about the rise of the German fascism from as a result of the economic deprivation of punishment of Germany, so to say, and of the hyperinflation of the 20s. In the same way, the Russian fascism of today rose from the hyperinflation of the 90s and of the way that the Cold War was kind of won by the West, yeah, that decided to punish the peoples of the former Soviet Union for being communist, while allowing the elites to basically plunder and become like what they are. So so Russian fascism is not only a product of European history and present, it's also being sponsored and funded by the European Union as we speak, most notably Germany, that's paying exorbitant amounts of euros every day for kind of in return for Russian fossil fuels. And here is where basically I think the key problem lies with this kind of symbiotic alliance between European, how to call this, powers and Russian fascist regime. And this is the question of fossil fuels. Yeah, this is the question of extractivism, and this, in the end, is the question of the climate. Yeah, it's a question of planetary survival of us humans as a species. Yeah, it's a bit bigger than the survival of Ukraine as a state or of Ukraine as a political nation, even though this is basically what is probably most at stake. But what's at stake in the long run is basically our ability as humanity to stop fossil fascism, to kind of break this unholy alliance between big extractivist capital and authoritarian governments, this kind of self-perpetuating loop of spiral of political authoritarianism and extractivist attitude towards natural resources. This is, of course, a question to be addressed to the so-called Western powers, most importantly Germany. It's interesting to recall now that the project, the extractivist gigantic project known as Nord Stream 2, that's been a joint project by Germany and already openly fascist Russia, has only been stalled basically a day after Putin declared war on Ukraine and a day before the troops actually crossed the border. So it was really that bad. Like their symbiosis, their alliance was really that deep. They could not really abandon this project of natural gas extraction and emission that should have not happened anyway. And everyone knew that it shouldn't have happened, not for the sake of Ukraine, but it shouldn't have happened because someone actually, like we all actually know that we should just stop burning fossil fuels, like really, for real, if we are kind of serious about survival on this planet. So I'm already, I think, in kind of around the third part of my answer. I would still say a couple of words about the second question about the cultural institutions, and it's going to be very brief. I think in the times of fascist threat like this, all institutions, but first and foremost, cultural institutions should just switch to actively kind of anti-fascist mode. There's no sense in any other position rather than openly anti-fascist position, by like which also these days includes anti-extractivist, kind of anti-fossil fuel, basically ecological thinking, and action. And so I don't think the cultural institutions these days can afford to be not to be anti-fascist institutions and not to be ecological institutions. Which basically brings us to this, brings me to this third question about what are we not talking about here that we should talk about. So I would suggest that every conversation about Ukraine is actually a conversation about kind of opposition to authoritarian extractivist rule, to the regime that is not just destroying democracy, but it is destroying the planet. Yeah, I could go on for a long time about the role of Ukraine, Russia, and Germany triangle in the anti-extractivist struggles of today, but this is basically what I would like simply to bring to the table, and maybe I don't know, follow up the discussion if you want. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexi. And Vasyl, I also wanted to ask you, before we get to Q&A, and please put your questions in the chat, maybe for both of you, what questions do you have for us on this side? Just throw it at us. And let's have a discussion, because I think we ask questions, we constantly, give us answers. But what is it that, and this, this can be a very long discussion, but anyway, just something that comes to mind maybe, or you've been wanting to talk about and ask. Either of you could take this for however.
But we did, no?
Sorry?
No, I just think we did that.
Oh, you
Okay. No, but maybe Vasyl has, yeah.
Yeah, in a way,
yeah.
I would just add to this point of the so-called Western left, or whatever you call it actually these days. Well, I think that mostly this kind of reaction that we got from that side of the political spectrum is very much defined by the constant dominant alliance that we have had throughout the perhaps last few decades, which is basically the fusion between neoliberal forces and right-wing populism. And I think basically that also in turn was a result of the total abandonance of the so-called political left by all the fronts that some time ago it had been occupying. And I mean here that basically in this sense it's very hard to expect something more from these forces, because they only are keeping this kind of a name of the left. Maybe to some extent, maybe it's a genuine claim in a way, but at the same time, I think in the situation when the so-called right wing is basically defined by some type of nostalgia towards, of course, imagined past. The left, let's not forget, is very much defined by, just maybe to use also kind of a psychoanalytical term in this sense, but what Yulia Kristeva used to call melancholy, right? Which is actually based on a kind of a lost object that we can only miss, but we cannot directly refer to because it's already dead. So in this sense, I think that the dead body of Lenin in Moscow is also a good symbol for that. So that in this sense, they don't have a direct connection to the current political reality, only because they are rather sticking to some fetishes, as I am not a political or fetishist at all. So for me, I think this is a pretty problematic, just because you cannot conduct a real political agenda only being based on the fetishes, which are kind of frozen objects that you can only hang on the wall, but not really work with them as a tool or as any kind of instrument in a real political field. So, and that is also in turn is very much defined, but by what Alexi also partly referred to, is that this kind of fascist military dictatorship that Russia has been turned into, it didn't appear out of the blue just yesterday, right? It took years to be established and to reach this really point of no return. So in this sense, let's not forget that it was exactly the political center, this kind of a political normality that has been feeding this fascist aggressor for years in a literal and also in metaphorical sense, preparing all the conditions, all these symbolic circumstances for it to flourish. So I don't mean here that the history repeats itself in some perverse mode, but I mean that it's so to some extent, I think that for this normal, so to say, political center that so many political forces nowadays in Europe, but also in the US represent, right? It's also very I mean, that this is very much defined by their stance that it's very problematic for them to question this situation directly, only because they are in a way dependent on that. So, and Nord Stream 2 is just one of the examples, because of course it had been rationalized by the fact that Germans, of course, couldn't imagine with their economy first approach that the Russian government and their fascist leader could just easily throw out billions and billions of investments just to the trash bin for what they imagine as for nothing. But at the same time, I think that is exactly the lesson that to some extent it was also these normal businesses and normal politicians who also had prepared the same conditions for that variant of fascism to come in the 20th century. So I think that this kind of postmodern approach, if we put it like that, the current political spectrum is very much defined by that thought that basically this type of behavior and this type of political approach as a fascist one has been already left behind in the 20th century. And that's why I think that in this sense, it was not by occasion, of course. It was later, as Alexi said, was supported by this openly fascist manifesto published by the official press agency RIA Novosti, right? Openly stating its genocidal purpose of eliminating all the Ukrainians as such. But it was not by occasion that this full-on assault on Ukraine was justified absurdly by the discourse of so-called denazification and demilitarization. I think that is also the lesson that of also what we have to draw from the fascist history as well. That, but it also works for any ideology. But because an ideology trying to hide its own sort of hidden core always lays it bare in plain sight. So I think that today we are actually facing an absolutely heavyweight work that lies ahead of us, which is basically, if we are really seriously thinking of any future amidst this war catastrophe, right? That the only chance for it to come is basically to make Russia go through full and profound demilitarization and denazification. Because the West, or maybe Europe in particular, has already experienced this kind of really ground-shaking commitment. But as far as I can see, this is the only chance for the new foundations of our Commonwealth. Hopefully without, of course, any extractivism too. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Vasyl and Alexi. We have a question. We have Q&A, I guess now. And we have Slinko, who was one of our organizers and helped us with everything. Yes, you're unmuted.
All right, thanks. I apologize to other people who are asking questions because I asked to ask it in person. First of all, hi, Vasyl, and hi, Alexi. It was really good to meet you a couple of years ago in Kyiv. I want to ask, you brought up a lot of interesting analysis, and I have been reading your writing, which was very, very helpful. Even for me, even though I am myself from Donbass and this war has been in my life for 8 years as well. So the question I have is very specific. I just want to limit myself. When I talk to my friends here, you know, very leftist, very left-leaning, there is this lingering sense that the traditional alliance of the left with the pacifist sort of intentions does not allow them to understand what is like how to handle the response to the invasion. Do you know what I mean? Like they they argue that we would rather should just negotiate. So I wonder at this point where Ukraine has made a choice to fight back with the help of the Western weapons, like heavily supplied, what would be your response to this kind of pacifist argument that, you know, oh, we should have maybe negotiated early on and saved lives and infrastructures? So please go ahead.
Yeah, if I may respond, thanks for this question, really, and for bringing this up. And like I would say, I would try to remind that not just pacifism has been an important part of the leftist politics and culture and identity for a very long time, but no less profound element of leftism has always been anti-fascism, right? And I don't think that either of those components, should kind of dominate over or cancel each other. But at some points, the anti-fascist stance of the left is seriously jeopardized by kind of misplaced pacifism. I mean, I don't know how else to explain it, but being a pacifist in the 1930s on the left was not a really good idea, yeah, not just on the left. As I said, I would say that response to the question is like, don't forget about your anti-fascist commitment if you are a leftist. And as for escalation versus negotiation, because I've seen another really good question in the chat about this, I think that it's kind of, we've been into a situation during this war already, and before, and for 8 years we've been in a situation where one side of the war escalates and the other side negotiates. Yeah, and this is where brought us here, actually, where one side was basically allowed to escalate as much as it intended to until it got basically a violent response. Yeah, it got a strong military response that was completely unexpected from the side that basically was supposed to be negotiating, and that's it. And negotiating the terms of basically its surrender. No one takes this seriously as a negotiation option. So basically what's going on now is that both sides negotiate, yeah, and the side that's been only escalating, that is Russia, is actually has to negotiate, and it's kind of trying to even do so, even though it doesn't really work well for them or for anyone else. So that would be my answer in short.
Yeah, in that regard, I would just add that basically, I think especially with regards to the left or leftism, this war became a kind of a crash test for them, in the sense that what is really striking, and I think maybe I don't like this kind of wording that is usually popularly used, but I think this is a good example of what is called westplaining, right? That you basically hear from the left side of the political spectrum in that regard a typical Trumpian argument that both sides are guilty, because the left in the West cannot even, they are so much obsessed with the role of NATO and America that they cannot even imagine and to leave the space that any other alien could be the main evil. No, it can only be America or NATO, which is the main evil of the world. So it only says that they are so self-narcissistic that they cannot even imagine that there is another evil in the world that it can even, overcome the usual one for them. So in this sense, of course, it's a crash of their world, that they cannot abandon their own fetishes, as I said. So that's why they are rather accusing NATO or the US or the eastward enlargement of NATO or whatever, just not to accuse the old fetish, because they are still keeping this fetish from the communist times, which they think, or they were thinking, was a kind of an alternative to the capitalist world, right? Though it's like a super, the guy whom Putin hates most, Lenin used to call it childish diseases of the left, right? But as for pacifism, I think this is another type of total really misconception, because Alexi already referred to this badly, but I also a bit wrote about this, because it's basically like that the very idea of pursuing peace, which is super defining, of course, for most of the Western governments, became an international norm to follow, not because leftists or liberals were trying to make a kind of a dialogue with fascists or trying to appease them, but only because they took arms in their hands and defeated fascists on the battlefield. Only afterwards, pacifism became an international norm. So I think this is a total confusion of the causes and consequences of the historical process. Even in a literal sense. So any claim towards pacifism nowadays, I think these are just lucky people who are privileged enough to keep their bubble around them. Unfortunately or fortunately, we just don't have this privilege anymore, and we were deprived of it already after the revolution itself in 2018, I think.
Thanks for these answers. We have a question by Marjorie Kramer. Would you like to? Carolyn, could we unmute? If you'd like to speak, or I can read out the question.
Should be able to unmute Marjorie.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, well, I don't know. I was thinking that if we get into a war with the nuclear bombs and things, that we would all be even worse off than we are now, including the Ukrainian people. But I can't imagine how it is to have your families and your houses and your country just being smashed. I can't. I am in a bubble. That's, I guess, all I have to say.
Thank you.
Hmm.
We have also, hang on, let me check. We have a question by Tanya as well, if you'd like to. I'm not sure where you are, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for organizing and thank you for presenting, Vasyl and Alexi. Alexi mentioned that it's very difficult for people right now to recognize fascism in Europe, and I've noticed this with my friends in Europe as well. It's very difficult for them to say this out loud, and particularly in one conversation it came up, and I thought that the main reason, possibly not the main, but one of the reasons, is that it's very difficult for them to see white people as villains. It's sort of, there is this discussion of why Russians cannot recognize that their state is doing this horrors, and there was an example of saying that children found out that their father is a serial killer. It's impossible for them to perceive it, so they start to defend them. And it's the same thing that's happened to Russians. They just cannot recognize themselves as villains. And the same for the world, for Europe, for America, to recognize white people as villains in this case. What's your opinion about that? Why do you think it's so difficult for us to recognize fascism right now? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. It's a really good question. I read it before in the chat some minutes ago, and I spent basically those minutes thinking about this. I'm not sure I have a, yeah, I can, it's an interesting perspective, totally new for me in a way. Thanks for bringing this up. I think I can supplement this perspective about, this difficulty. I think it's particularly difficult for some people to imagine not just white people as villains, but also particularly to imagine Russians being a fascist kind of state, and Russians actively supporting a fascist leader because of the way basically the historical memory of the Second World War and the victory over German Nazism has been handled, and has been misrepresented as a victory of Russia somehow, even though Russia as a state did not exist at the time of the victory of the Soviet Union, which won by means of its Red Army, which has not been a Russian army in the first place. And I think because of this misconception, that which is kind of gross and really kind of ridiculous, tragically historical misconception about Russian army allegedly liberating Nazi Germany, liberating Germans. So I've got bad news for people who still think so, and for some people it really kind of changes. I noticed it changes their kind of the whole kind of history. Whole view crumbles. It was not the Russian army, it was the Red Army, a communist multinational army where many nations have been participating, including the Russian nation, of course, but the role of many other nations, such as Ukrainians, Belarus, Georgians, and so on, has been erased from this history after the war, when kind of Russia-centric late Soviet Union was able to claim this as a Russian victory. Yeah, it was the Russian army simply did not exist during the time of the war with Hitler. So because of this misconception, I think it's definitely difficult to comprehend the fascist nature of the Russian state these days.
Yeah, thank you. I think just to follow what Alexi also just described, I think that's exactly it's very good question, because it has at least several dimensions. That's basically, of course, that's very much true that Russia is, I mean, modern Russia after the Soviet Union's collapse has been presenting itself as a successor to all the Soviet heritage, and through that just simply robbing other nations which were unavoidable part of the Soviet Union and co-creators of the Soviet Union as such historically from 1922 basically, right? And that's why it's also very much presented in a perverse manner. That's why basically the 9th of May, this great victory, as it's called, day is very much transformed into a kind of very transgressive ritual through which the current Russian fascism is just exercising its own obscenity, but just under the official cover, so to say. But apart from that, I think this is also very nice racial, so to say, aspect that was posed within this question. You are exactly right that it's very hard to recognize the white people as villains, because it was exactly one of the reasons and behind the shock and unwillingness to act during already the Second World War from the West side and from the European side in general to react to the Nazis' atrocities, because it was unimaginable that the white people are doing these massacres to the white people. That it's not somewhere in like blacks against the whites. It's not somewhere in Africa or in other continents, but in the very heart of the white civilization. That because of course, and that's why it's basically anti-Semitism. I think it was Etienne Balibar or whoever put it precisely that way, that anti-Semitism is a kind of a universal racism, because it was not by occasion that the Jews were forced to wear signs on their clothes, right? These yellow stars, in order to recognize them, because you cannot recognize them immediately because they are of the same skin. So it is exactly of the racial unconscious in a way that it was already hard to accuse white people, Germans, in making these atrocities to other white people, Germans as well, right? And apart from that, I think that what is also very interesting in this sense is this inability to call a spade or to call a fascist nowadays, especially in the European context, in the Western context in general, is because I think this is the kind of also a theoretical tradition with also a practical implication, which, by the way, was also criticized by Hannah Arendt in Eicham in Jerusalem, right, as well. That's why that book was not very well received, by the way, also by the Jewish circles back then. It was exactly that fascism has been, and Nazism has been constantly perceived as a kind of a metaphysical evil, but not as a direct political practice. That because the level of atrocities, the level of atrocities was so high that it was very hard to conceptualize, even not only to put on trial, but to embrace this mentally, all these camps and all these all the massacres that had been done. It was a kind of seduction to make this a kind of to put this evil on a metaphysical level, but not on a political level, because practically that's why what was showed afterwards, right? That it was a kind of an ordinary political job, even not political one. It was just a usual everyday job to make fascists happen. So I think this kind of perception that Nazism or fascism is so much unbelievable that it's behind our appreciation, that doesn't allow the majority of people to call today's fascism, I think. Thanks so much for this question. It's super crucial.
Thanks so much. That was a really great question, Tanya. Do we have any more questions from the audience or from Brooklyn Rail? Let me check. We have a question from Brooklyn Rail. If someone wants to unmute, I wasn't sure who it's from.
Yeah, we were just thinking, I mean, this was addressed a bit already, but I think a lot of, I don't know, the contemporary conversation around like the co-option of the word peace, and as you were saying earlier, like even humanitarian efforts. And I think we think about that, or I don't want to say we is such a disparate term, but I think a lot of current conversations about Palestine, right, kind of reframed that for many of us. And I mean, you addressed sort of this co-option of humanitarian effort, but I think just thinking that through again here as well, that was it. You know, if anybody wanted to speak to Palestine in comparison to this, but that's pretty big too.
Any other questions from the audience or Brooklyn Rail? Anyone for our guests? Comments? I know it's a difficult subject, but Slinko, yes, I see your hand. Oh, you still unmute. Hang on.
Sorry.
Good.
Just a brief question, kind of. I was thinking about the Russian state, the Russian citizen identity, and I became convinced that without domination, aggression, and war, they basically have no identity in themselves as a nation. So that stems from Russia imagining itself only as a colonial power or the Russian Empire, but Russia itself doesn't seem to exist, like what you mentioned historically, in terms of Russia co-opting the Soviet heritage and the narratives of communism and socialism. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this, like the vacuous and very violent absence from which they seem to try to present themselves as existing.
That's a good question. It's a hard one. Yeah, Vasyl.
Yeah, just shortly, I think you mentioned the key words, Slinko, in that regard. I think this is exactly about what is, I think in Latin is called horror vacui, right? This like horror of the absence, of the abyss. Because basically all these, even if you take into account all these like ideas to recreate some imaginable Russian or Soviet greatness, this is basically a caricature of the past, because all those claims, those made by the Kremlin leader himself or by his propagandists or whoever, they don't have any real historical background. This is just a kind of a bricolage or mixture of some facts together with lies, together with some fantasies, but at the same time, let's not forget that I think, and this is basically alpha and omega, or rather Z, right? Z, with regards to the current branding of this war, of the whole Putin's regime, that they can claim whatever they want, but the main thing they are super obsessed with is, and it has been always like that since the beginning of the Second Chechen War in 1999, since basically the beginning of this century, right? That the main thing is just to do everything possible to prevent even a precedent of overthrowing the dictator by the people. This is it. I mean, they can talk about so many things, but it doesn't matter at all, because that was the real reason, and that was exactly why he has smashed all the opposition at his own country. And that is why he rushed to smash all the so-called Maidans in Belarus, in Syria, to save his, or in Kazakhstan earlier this year, just to save his counterparts in these countries. So that is why exactly why he invaded Ukraine several days after the Maidan revolution, just to prevent any kind of revolution at all as a precedent. That's why, by the way, in spite of his historical claims, he has, and the whole Russian Federation has lots of problems with the Soviet heritage, because the Soviet Union, we like it or not, but it had a revolutionary start. And that's why he can take a lot from the Stalin's regime, but that's why he hates Lenin exactly, because I mean, because the not even Russia, but the pretext for the Russian existence, like these years, these 5 years actually between 1917 and 1922, those were the most revolutionary years in the Russian history, and he hates them most. That's why he can claim whatever he likes, but at the same time, I think this is a kind of, in this sense, it's a failed claim and a failed state and failed political state, because there is no real ground behind these claims.
Yeah, I can only maybe briefly add to that really void that is at the center of the Russian fascist regime, and this void is actually comes in the form of its kind of anti-West or anti-European attitude. Yeah, so it tries to present itself as anti-Western or anti-European, and by doing that, to try to deny the fact that there is no other kind of Russian project. There is no other Russian state, and there is no other Russian nation that would not be a product of the West, basically. Yeah, so it's trying to reinvent itself as kind of anti-West, but it is the ultimate West. Yeah, so Russian state is basically a settler colonialist state. Yeah, that emerged in the East of Europe as a result of an eastward expansion of white Slavic peoples. Yeah, in that sense, it's a mirror process to the westward expansion of the white settlers from Europe westwards. And Russia is just a part of that. And by trying to deny itself its kind of European roots, it's actually just trying to deny the fact that it leaves us with this void, with this kind of obscene void of the European fascist core at the root of this regime. So this is just a byproduct of the European civilization, and that's why they have to cover it by claiming this void.
Thanks for your answers. We have a question from Betsheva. I think Betsheva has a question.
Hi.
Hi.
I guess I just wanted to echo Marjorie's question, because as a Ukrainian, I feel like I'm sort of always having to counter a lot of disinformation and sort of general framing of why Americans have to care about what's happening in Ukraine, and why it's really important to send weapons to Ukraine, and why that doesn't necessarily quantify that it would involve World War II and nuclear war, World War III and nuclear war for the rest of the world. So, I mean, my understanding and you know, how I usually talk about it or try to frame it is that you know, it's a lot of Cold War rhetoric and fear mongering from the part of Russia that is like creating this. And we see those of us who are able to stomach watching little bits of Russian propaganda at a time, we see how much they revel in, you know, sort of talking about their own nuclear power. But then at the same time, we see how they're sort of not really showing that in the way this war is playing out. So I guess I would just like to see what Vasyl or Alexi have to say, and what they usually answer to this question. Thank you.
Yeah, I can start maybe. So thanks for both of these questions and comments, Sheva and also Marjorie. I have a very simple kind of answer, if there is an answer to that will probably not be very satisfactory. But if you really don't want to have like a World War III with nuclear weapons, it's just solution is, I think, probably just one, and the solution is Russia has to be stopped in Ukraine. Yeah, because there's not a necessity that this war will lead to World War III, but if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, it will sooner or later attack a NATO country, and then there would be no other option for the so-called collective of self-defense and so on. But this will definitely happen, it seems, if Russia is not stopped here. And there's a good chance that Russia is stopped here, and by doing so, we avoid nuclear war, I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would just add even a shorter answer from my side. Why to answer into the question why Americans should care about Ukraine? It's exactly because without Ukraine, you wouldn't get rid of Trump. And actually, this is one of the most important contributions of the modern Ukraine to America's history, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, for the answers, for the questions. Do we have any more questions from our audience? We have, okay, let me see. We have a comment okay, from Olga. I'm not sure, Olga, if you want to unmute and comment or ask a question. I don't know if I can't see where you are. Olga?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I couldn't unmute myself. Right
Okay, I unmuted you. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was just a comment regarding the question or the comment that Russians so vacuous and it's a void. I think it's you are talking about ideological void, right? So that there. This ideology, Putin's kind of ideological construction about Russia's strong nation under attack, right? So, and also he likes to point out that Russia is a multinational country or multinational nation, so, which also kind of he's trying to preemptively cut off their acquisitions in fascism, right? So that emphasizing, stressing that Russia is multinational and Ukraine, somehow Ukrainian nation also kind of like a part of the Russian nation, right? So that he's trying to construct some kind of ideological, complicated structures to prevent this acquisitions in fascism. But this is ideology, this is not identity. And so we should not conflate these two things, even if they are conflated at the moment, because I don't know the statistics in Russia, but apparently there are a lot of people who are brainwashed by this ideology, and they identify with this war, but it's still ideology. And because identity is much more complex thing, and we have to detect the identity. I mean, it's also construct. Of course, identity is also constructed, but this construction is what's happening over the centuries, right? So that we have to separate, at least in our minds, this kind of identity as a construct and ideology as a construct, even if they are intertwined sometimes. So, and I think that the only way to detect the identity and to analyze the identity and start decolonizing Russian identity and Russian history. But simply saying that Russian identity is vacuous and void, I mean, it's not helping us. So that's it.
Well, I'm curious, what is Russian identity? But I think that's a lot. and what is happening? Why is Russia not protesting? And we know there, the consequences of protesting today. But I think there's a bigger conversation to be had for.
Yeah, it's
right. But I think this is exactly right. So we have to differentiate that. I agree with Olga to some extent. But the problem is that after the crash of the Soviet utopia, Russia found itself in a post-Soviet dystopia. So that is also the problem of its identity. And of course, you can have many ideologies or referring to multinationalism or whatever, and to coloniality at the same time. But the lack of answer to this dystopian condition is also something which is defining the current identity, whether it's imagined or not, or how is it being practiced. So in this sense, I think this, so in political sense of identity, Ukraine doesn't have problems with that, because it's enough to say Maidan, so, and it's all clear here on spot, right? But as for Russia, it's rather for you to decide, or I mean, for your compatriots or those who are living there. So in this sense, I think that is exactly the problem that Russians or the Russian authorities, or I don't know, how do you separate those both, that they are mixing these ideological stances with identity problems, because perhaps the identity of Yakutia and of Chechnya and of St. Petersburg are totally different, or Tatarstan. I don't know whether they are the same or not, but that is exactly that you have decided. But not to let others to face the uncanny consequences of this constant indecision, in a way.
Thanks for that, Vasyl. So I think if we don't have any more questions, right, from our audience, we can have a last question.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your questions. And we'd just like to turn it over to Fong, our very own Fong Bui from the Rail, for a question.
Thank you so much, you. I was in and out, didn't hear entirely what was being said, but I heard the tail end of it. And of course, having been brought up in Vietnam, I survived through the war on labor camp, so I know the measure of human suffering in some degree, for sure. But I was thinking, you're absolutely right, that fighting for Ukraine is fighting for democracy, definitely for the West and everyone in between, for sure. And I was thinking also, because having sort of be reminded, Hermann Goering, when he was appear in the Nuremberg trial before taking the poison pill, I think before he was to be hanged, he says something very profound. I could only paraphrase right now. He says something in the fact that naturally the common people don't want war, neither in Russia nor in England or anywhere else, including Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag people along. Where it is democracy or a fascist dictator or a parliament or a communist dictator, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is to tell them they are being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. So it's very intense thinking that way, but we constantly have to remind ourselves that, Putin is an ex-KGB official, who witnessed the end of communism and the collapse of Soviet Union in 91. He took it as a disgrace to Russia, which ever seemed to me, I just wrote in my editorial this month, that it consumed him, as an ultimate goal. Doesn't matter what it takes. he'll make himself to be a president of Russia, which he got himself to be elected, passing down the baton, you know, Yeltsin really in 2000. So that was his aim, to restore the glorious past of Russian Empire. Zelensky, we learned quickly, was a former actor and comedian who I just watched the whole famous show, you know, Servant of the People. I mean, whatever happened in that series make him so popular, he became the president in real life. It's so interesting to me because just 5 months before the outbreak of COVID-19, really, you can imagine, for me, I looked at two of them by contrast, almost like a Greek tragedy and comedy, because seeing Putin, you know, weighty contempt in his heart, so heavily led like in his head, he living with constant fear for his life, especially now, avoiding COVID, appearing with his staff. You can see the distant, you know, I, for the first time, saw fear revealed in his facial expression and his physiognomy. It's so interesting to me. And I just couldn't help but to think of Zelensky, lightness of spirit, the opposite, driven by the law of comics, you know, as you all remember, Henri Bergson, who wrote the famous book on laughter, he said, comic is not a mere pleasure of the intellect. It is human and social condition. It has significant meaning, you know, and I was thinking about it because, you know, look at how he's been so agile. I mean, he appeared wearing t-shirt, identify with people, working people, and those who joined the reserve army. That to me is the key difference, because Ukraine have a long history, basically rebelling against the idea of the state, nobility. You know, they are truly already endowed with their democratic aspiration. It's not just recently that they became that way. So there are definitely hope. I think fighting for Ukraine is fighting for democracy. And that's why I think it's important for everybody in the West. I think recently Finland, you know, joining as well, and German have just sent tanks and whatnot. And I hope the American could do even more. But so there's hope. There's definitely hope. So that's all I have to share with you all. Thank you so much, Tanya. It's great. Katya, you're great. Vasyl's great. Alexi, all of you are Slinko. Thank you so much. To be continued, because this is a kind of gathering that Tocqueville had one American from the get-go, what he called the art of joining. And this is to be continued, to continue forever, because there's so many things that we can also begin talking. My head is running with feverish ideas and comment coming in right now, but I think we need to maybe go get some lunch. But to be continued, can you all promise to be in touch? It's important.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that is a great wrap up of the talk. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Vasyl. Thank you. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Alex.
you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you really, yeah, for joining. Thank you, guys. Yeah, we have a tradition that where we end with like poetry, but I think, yeah, we really appreciate, just want to make this space like for you all to share any more last resources if you'd like in the chat. And yeah, we really are so grateful. Please take care of yourselves, stay safe. Yeah, and thank you so much again.
Yeah, thanks so much. Let's stay in touch. Look forward.
Please do.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Vasyl.
so much.
Thanks.
Thank
You
you.
love and courage. Thank you, Katya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adriana.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Slinko.
Thank you, Slinko.
Thanks,
Thank
Vasyl.
Bye,
Thank you, Alexi.
guys.
In
Thank you.
solidarity.
everyone.
In solidarity. Much love.
Solidarity. Thank you.
Слава Україні!
Слава Україні!
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!